called us through the gospel to possess the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Hallelujah! Hallelujah! Hallelujah!
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
There was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. And when the wine ran short, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, how does your concern affect me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servers, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washings, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told them, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it. And when the head waiter tasted the wine, the water that had become wine, without knowing where it had come from, although the servers who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves good wine first, and then, when people have drunk freely, an inferior one. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this as the beginning of his signs at Cana in Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples began to believe in him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
On the day that Kathy and I were married, it was the hottest day of the year in Arcadia. July 15th, 1978, it was 102 degrees by the time the wedding mass was over, and we had planned an outdoor reception in my parents' backyard. The amount of joy present was equaled only by the amount of perspiration present. Nobody turned water into wine on that day. About the strangest thing that happened was that someone inadvertently put alcohol in the punch bowl that was for the kids. A good thing we discovered that. Today's gospel is about a wedding attended by both Mary and Jesus, and before the celebration is over, the wine runs out. Now, this would have been a huge problem in first century Jewish cultures, and it would have been very embarrassing for the bride and groom if anyone asked for more wine, but there wasn't any. Mary finds out about this, and she tells the servants who were working the wedding, "Do whatever he tells you." The he in that verse is Jesus, of course. So Mary's telling the servants that Jesus will fix the problem as long as they do exactly what he tells them to do. And whenever I read this story, this verse always jumps out at me as the heart of the message. This is the key phrase. As God's servants, this is, in a nutshell, what we're called to do. We're to do whatever God tells us. There's no wiggle room in that statement. There are no conditions for obedience. Mary doesn't tell the servants, "Do whatever he tells you if," or "Do whatever he tells you as long as." We're not called to do whatever he tells you except, no, we're supposed to do whatever he tells us, period. Whatever God's will is for our lives, whatever he wants us to do both at this moment and in the future is what we're supposed to do as his servants. We're not supposed to follow his will only if it seems reasonable to us or if we agree that it's the best thing to do. We're not supposed to follow his will just as long as we can see that it'll all turn out well for us. We're not supposed to serve him on the condition that we'll get something out of it. No. Like the servants in the story of the wedding at Cana, we're called to follow God's will unconditionally. We're called to serve him no matter what. Then the servants in the story actually did that. They do exactly what Jesus tells them to do. He instructs them to fill those 6 large stone jars with water and bring them to the wine steward. Whenever I read this part, I can just imagine how they must have reacted to Jesus' words. What were they thinking? You want us to do what? They must have thought he was crazy. Remember, Jesus hadn't performed any miracles yet in this point in his life, so they didn't know about his divine powers. Probably sounded like he was telling them to give water to the steward and just pretend it was wine. It must have sounded crazy to them, but they did it anyway. The Bible doesn't tell us why they did it, but I've always thought that they must have been so desperate not to anger anyone or be embarrassed that they were willing to try anything, no matter how crazy it must have seemed. But even if I'm wrong, the point is that they did what Jesus told them to do, even though they couldn't have any idea what his plan was. They just trusted him and obeyed. And that's a great example for us to follow. We don't always know what God's doing with our lives or where he's taking us, but we should trust him anyway. We may sometimes feel like God has completely lost his mind or he's leading us on one wild goose chase after another, but we should trust him anyway. Sometimes it can seem as though you're driving on a dark night. You know, my favorite author, E.L. Doctorow, once said, "You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can still make the whole trip that way." Faith can sometimes be so difficult for us that we feel like we're just going through the motions because it's what we're used to. We should always do as he says, though. When we're at our worst, even when our faith feels smaller than the smallest mustard seed, and all we can do is just go through the motions, God still accepts what we can give him. He didn't ask the servants to understand why they were filling the stone jars with water or to be happy about what they were doing. He knew that he could count on their obedience, and that was enough. Likewise, when you and I just can't seem to summon enough faith to feel good about where God is leading us or what he's doing with our lives, he doesn't ask more of us than we can give him. If all we can do is just obey without feeling optimistic about the outcome of our actions, God will accept that. The important thing is that we stay the course, not that we always understand or feel good about it. And then at the end of the story, Jesus rewards the servants' obedience by doing something they never imagined what would happen. He turned the water into wine. Now at that point, his plan became clear to them, and they understood why he had told them to do something that seemed so ridiculous just a few minutes earlier. Jesus had a plan for the situation, and even though filling stone jars with water might have seemed silly at the time, it all worked out for good in the end. And the result was even more favorable than they could have imagined, because when the steward tasted the wine, it was even better than what had been served initially. Now, that's not to say that everything will always be okay or always be fine for us here on earth. Unfortunately, that's just not the way things happen in a fallen world. There's a reason why in the Hail, Holy Queen, the prayer that we say at the end of the rosary, we call this life a valley of tears. We're going to suffer, and things may not always be okay. That's simply not what God promises us. He never said anything about how our earthly lives will progress on our journeys. But what he did promise is that in the end, it will all come together. In the end, if we obey God's will for our lives, our works will bear fruit, even if we're not able to even see it. If we obey God's will for our lives, we'll experience the new heaven and the new earth that will come at the end of history, where he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, and neither shall be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Make no mistake, our Catholic faith is not about some prosperity gospel that tells us everything will be perfect here on earth as long as we follow God. No. Things won't always be the way we hope in this life. I remember Father David once saying that God may not cure you of the disease from which you are suffering, but he will walk with you every step of the way and show you how to endure, perhaps even draw joy from it. Suffering will always be a part of our lives here, always. But if we obey God and we do what he tells us to do, we can be assured that all the pain, all the suffering, all the tears we experience here on earth will be worth it. If we remain faithful then in our response, everything we go through in this life will lead us to a glorious future with God and all the saints, where we'll no longer cry or feel pain. That's the goal. That's the goal. That's where God's leading us if we just obey his call. And even if we don't understand it, even if it seems ridiculous to us, even if we can't feel anything except confusion and sadness, our faith reassures us that as long as we follow God, as long as we give him whatever we can, as small as it may be, he'll accept it and bring us to the new heaven and the new earth that he's planned for each and every one of us. And it's simple, simple. Do whatever he tells you.